Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, endless ocean. The waves crash against the shore, each one a reminder of both danger and opportunity. The salt wind burns your eyes. The tide shifts beneath your feet, and the horizon is filled with mysteries unknown. To step into the water is to risk death, powerful currents, lurking crocodiles, and predators of the deep. And yet, for our ancestors 3.5 million years ago, the sea was not just a threat, it was a lifeline. With no boats, no nets, and no tools beyond sticks and stones, they began to learn the secrets of the shoreline. Shellfish, stranded fish, and seaweed became food that saved them when storms ravaged the land. The sea tested them, but it also taught them. The question is, how did fragile land-dwelling apes first endure the dangers of the sea? And why was this step so vital for the story of humanity itself? Before we begin this journey into the forgotten coasts of our ancient world, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of our prehistoric story. 3.5 million years ago, Africa's coastlines were not quiet beaches, they were frontiers of survival. The Pliocene epoch had reshaped the land, pulling the seas higher and carving tidal flats, lagoons, and rocky shores. These environments were both perilous and rich. To predators like crocodiles, sharks, and giant seabirds, the coast was a hunting ground. But for early hominins, it became something else, an untapped source of life. Australopithecus afarensis, small, upright apes who split their time between forests and savannas, were not natural swimmers. They had no gills, no fins, no webbed hands. To them, the ocean was a terrifying, alien force. Yet when storms destroyed inland food, when rivers flooded and plains were stripped bare, the coastline offered something no storm could wash away. Abundance. Shellfish clung to rocks. Fish stranded by tides flopped helplessly on the sand. Seaweed and edible plants grew in tidal pools. Carcasses of marine animals occasionally washed ashore, a feast for any brave enough to claim it. These resources did not require hunting, only daring. But every step into the shallows brought new risks, riptides, hidden predators, and the unknown. Over generations, our ancestors learned. They adapted behaviors for foraging along the waterline, teaching young to recognize safe pools, sharing shellfish scavenged at low tide. The sea became both a threat and a teacher. In facing it, they began to expand beyond the savanna, taking their first tentative steps toward the global wanderers humans would one day become. The story of how early humans survived at sea is not just about food. It is about courage, adaptability, and curiosity, the traits that would carry them far beyond the shoreline into the wider world. The world of 3.5 million years ago was not shaped only by savannas and forests, it was also defined by the meeting place of land and sea. The Pliocene epoch brought higher sea levels, reshaping Africa's edges into broad tidal flats, rocky headlands, and winding lagoons. These coastlines were wild, untamed borders, where storms could batter the land one day and calm tides reveal bounty the next. To Australopithecus afarensis, the coast was unlike any environment they had known. On the savanna, dangers came from predators in grass or trees. At the shoreline, the dangers were everywhere, beneath the waves, above in the skies, and even within the tides themselves. Crocodiles lingered in river mouths, sharks patrolled shallows, and giant seabirds scanned the beaches for prey. The waves themselves could drag a small, fragile body into waters from which there was no escape. And yet, the coastline was irresistible. It offered resources the inland could not. The rains might fail, grasslands might wither, but the ocean was constant. Twice each day, the tide shifted, exposing new opportunities. Fish trapped in pools, mollusks clinging to rocks, seaweed ripe for pulling. Here, survival meant learning to read the rhythm of the tides, to know when the water would retreat and when it would return in force. The storms of the Pliocene also played their role. After tempests, the beaches were littered with debris, driftwood, shells, even the occasional carcass of a stranded dolphin or whale. For early hominins, these were gifts, feasts too large for a single band to consume. The shoreline became not just a place of danger, but a frontier of abundance. But abundance demanded courage. Entering the shallows, even for a few steps, meant risk. Every splash could conceal a predator. Every pool had to be tested before hands reached in. The coastline became a classroom of survival, teaching lessons unlike those of the savannah. It taught awareness of tides, caution in unknown waters, and persistence in harvesting food that required patience rather than speed. Over time, these lessons carved themselves into behavior. Groups lingered near coasts longer, mapping safe pools and fruitful patches of rock. Elders taught the young to forage at low tide, passing knowledge across generations. The shoreline, dangerous as it was, became part of their mental landscape, a place where survival was possible if one had the courage and awareness to claim it. For Australopithecus afarensis, the coastlines of the Pliocene were not merely environments, they were thresholds, edges of both the land and of human possibility. Here, our ancestors began their first experiment with a world larger than the savannah, daring to reach into the sea and draw from it the sustenance of life. For Australopithecus afarensis, the shoreline was both terrifying and magnetic. They were land creatures, upright walkers with long arms still suited for climbing trees. They had no fins, no gills, and no natural defenses against the mysteries beneath the waves. And yet, desperation often drives courage. Hunger, drought, and storms push them closer to the sea until at last they dared to step into the shallows. The first steps were hesitant. Imagine a small band gathering at low tide. The ocean has retreated, leaving shallow pools glittering in the sunday. Within them, fish flicker, trapped by the retreating water. Shellfish cling stubbornly to rocks, their shells hiding precious protein. Seaweed floats at the surface, rich with salt and minerals. For the hominins, this was abundance waiting to be claimed if only they could overcome the fear of the water. They likely began by scavenging the simplest resources. A stranded fish flopping on the sand required no tools, only quick hands. Shellfish could be pried loose with stones or sticks. Seaweed could be pulled straight from the pools. These first experiments were small victories, meals that demanded neither hunting nor risk of predators on land. Over time, these victories built familiarity. The shallows were no longer alien, but extensions of their world. Still, every step carried risk. Crocodiles lurked where rivers met the sea, camouflaged in the muddy water. Sharp rocks and sea urchins could cut bare feet. Even waves themselves posed danger, knocking over the unwary and dragging them toward deeper water. Mothers clutched their infants tightly. Juveniles stayed close to elders, and males scanned the horizon for movement beneath the surface. Each venture into the shallows was a collective act of caution and courage, but the rewards outweighed the risks. Foraging at the water's edge offered food during times of scarcity inland. When storms had stripped the savannah, when fruits were gone and roots were hard to find, the sea remained. It became a fallback resource, a safety net that allowed groups to survive famine. These first steps into the water were not just physical, they were evolutionary. With every return to the shoreline, awareness grew. The hominins began to read the tides, learning that pools were richest after the ocean receded and dangerous when it rushed back in. They learned to recognize the smell of rotting fish after storms, guiding them to easy meals. They learned that some pools were safe for foraging while others hid danger. These lessons, repeated across generations, were the first whispers of coastal knowledge. The ocean was still wild, still dangerous, still feared. But by daring to touch its edges, our ancestors took one of their first great leaps of adaptability. The savannah had shaped their bodies, but now the sea began to shape their minds, teaching patience, awareness, and the courage to face the unknown. For early hominins, the savannah could be cruel. Droughts withered plants, predators stalked every clearing, and storms often left the land stripped bare. But at the shoreline, a different rhythm of survival existed. Here, the ocean gave as much as it threatened. The gifts of the shoreline were unlike anything the inland could offer, and they may have been the difference between extinction and endurance. The first and most obvious gift was food. Shellfish mussels, clams, and oysters clung to rocks at low tide, waiting to be pried open. To modern eyes, these may seem humble meals, but to Australopithecus afarensis, they were treasures. Rich in protein, packed with nutrients, and easy to gather once discovered. Small fish trapped in tidal pools provided quick catches, while crabs scuttling along the sand offered both challenge and reward. Even seaweed, salty and mineral-rich, could be eaten directly, a rare plant food that didn't depend on rainfall. The shoreline also gave scavenging opportunities unmatched by the savanna. After powerful storms, the beaches sometimes carried the carcasses of sea creatures, stranded dolphins, seals, or even whales. These enormous windfalls provided more food than a single group could consume, and though predators and scavengers competed for the spoils, the sheer scale of the bounty ensured that hominins could claim their share. Such feasts must have left powerful memories, cementing the coastline as a place of opportunity. Beyond food, the shoreline offered tools. Storms and tides carried driftwood and stones to the beaches. Smooth pebbles could be used for pounding or cracking shells. Sharp-edged rocks, split by waves, became cutting tools. Even simple objects like sticks hardened by salt water could serve as digging instruments. The ocean did not only feed our ancestors, it armed them with the first fragments of technology. There were subtler gifts too. The sea created pools of clean water after storms, safe for drinking. It also drew animals, birds, fish, and mammals that hominins could observe and learn from. Watching seabirds hunt fish may have inspired new strategies for foraging. Observing how tides stranded prey may have taught them the importance of timing and patience. Perhaps the greatest gift of the shoreline was stability. While the savanna shifted with seasons of rain and drought, the sea was reliable. Twice a day, tides exposed food. After every storm, new opportunities appeared. Even in famine, the coast offered something. For a fragile species, this consistency could mean the difference between collapse and survival. The shoreline was not generous out of kindness. It demanded risk, awareness, and courage. But for those who dared to face it, the rewards were undeniable. In shells, fish, driftwood, and tides, the ocean provided more than meals. It offered a new way of life. And in learning to claim the gifts of the shoreline, our ancestors took another crucial step on their long journey toward humanity. If the shoreline was a place of gifts, it was also a place of constant peril. The sea was never a safe ally. It was an unpredictable force, filled with dangers both seen and unseen. For Australopithecus afarensis, whose bodies were not built for swimming and whose knowledge of the ocean was limited to instinct and observation, every step into the shallows was a gamble with death. One of the greatest threats came from crocodiles. These ancient predators thrived where rivers met the sea. Camouflaged beneath muddy waters, they could strike in silence, jaws snapping shut with bone-crushing force. To drink from a tidal pool, or to wade into shallow water for stranded fish, was to risk ambush. Fossil evidence from the Pliocene shows bite marks on bones, grim reminders that some of our ancestors paid with their lives for venturing too close. Beyond crocodiles, sharks lurked in the coastal shallows. Smaller species patrolled tidal channels, but even these were deadly to creatures with no defenses beyond their hands and voices. A careless step into deeper waters could attract attention. For early hominins, the boundary between safe foraging pools and predator territory was razor thin. There were other dangers, less obvious but equally lethal. Sea urchins, sharp coral, and hidden rocks could wound bare feet, leaving infections that, in a world without medicine, often meant death. Strong rip currents could sweep the unwary into deeper waters, pulling them beyond their strength to return. Even waves themselves, when magnified by storms, could strike with the force of a predator, knocking small bodies from rocks and dragging them under. The skies above the sea carried threats too. Giant seabirds, with wingspans wider than a human's height, patrolled the coastline. They targeted small animals and sometimes even infants, left unguarded while their mothers foraged. To survive, groups learned caution. Infants were kept close, juveniles were warned not to wander, and the shoreline was never approached without vigilance. Yet perhaps the greatest danger was the unknown itself. The sea was vast, shifting, and unpredictable. On land, predators could be heard or tracked. In the water, they were invisible until it was too late. The ocean concealed its threats in silence, and fear of the unseen became a powerful part of survival behavior. The risks did not deter them, they taught them. Bands learned to forage only in the safest pools, to approach the shoreline at low tide, to keep watch while others gathered food. These adaptations were born not from choice but from necessity. Every danger beneath the waves demanded awareness, and awareness slowly became intelligence. The sea punished the careless, but it rewarded the cautious. And in that balance of fear and opportunity, Australopithecus afarensis found the first fragile foothold in a world beyond land. On the vast plains, danger often demanded speed run first, survive alone. But at the shoreline, survival depended on something deeper: unity. The sea was not an enemy that could be outrun. It was a force that required cooperation, timing, and shared awareness. For Australopithecus afarensis, the shoreline became more than a place of food. It became a school where the lesson was community. When the tide retreated, bands of early hominins moved together. Adults spread across the rocks, scanning for shellfish and small crabs, while juveniles gathered driftwood or carried finds back to camp. One individual pried open shells, while another stood watch for crocodiles or raptors circling above. In these moments, the shoreline resembled a theatre of shared purpose. Alone, a forager was vulnerable. Together, they formed a living shield of eyes and voices. Communication, even in its earliest form, played a vital role. They did not yet possess structured language, but vocal calls, gestures, and even pounding rocks together carried meaning. A sharp cry warned of movement in the grass. A raised arm signaled retreat from the water's edge. A series of rhythmic calls guided the group back towards safety. These primitive exchanges were the roots of something extraordinary. The first whispers of human speech, born not from idle chatter, but from the urgency of survival. Unity also meant sharing. A shell pried open with effort was passed around. A stranded fish became a group meal. Even marrow from drifted carcasses was cracked and divided. In the harsh world of the shoreline, selfishness was costly. Too many eyes were needed to watch for danger. Too many hands required to gather food. Cohesion ensured that no one starved alone and no predator struck unnoticed. The young learned by watching. Infants clung to their mothers, observing how shells were cracked or when to leap from a wave-washed rock. Older children mimicked their elders, practicing with small stones, turning play into preparation. The shore was not just a place of survival, it was a classroom where knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Even rest was communal. At night, groups huddled near fires if they had learned to keep them, or at least within protective circles of driftwood and rocks. While some slept, others remained half awake, ears tuned to the distant splash of waves or the growl of a predator moving too close. Exhaustion was dangerous, but taking turns kept the group alive. The shoreline taught an enduring truth, that survival was not the triumph of the strongest individual, but of the collective. Unity was their defense, their strategy, and ultimately their gift. In gathering, sharing, warning, and protecting, Australopithecus afarensis began to walk a path that separated them from every other creature. The ocean demanded cooperation, and in answering that demand, our ancestors discovered one of humanity's greatest strengths, the ability to stand not as prey alone, but as a group bound together by purpose. The sea was more than a source of food. It was a teacher. Every tide reshaped the shoreline, scattering objects across the sandstones, shells, driftwood, bones of fish, and marine mammals. To most creatures, these were debris. To Australopithecus afarensis, they were possibilities. Here, on the edge of land and water, the first sparks of human innovation began to glimmer. The simplest tools came from stone. Waves smoothed pebbles into perfect shapes for pounding and cracking shells. Sharp fragments, broken by the violent clash of rocks in the surf, were discovered to cut flesh more cleanly than teeth ever could. At first, these were used by chance. A lucky stone pried open a clam, or a sharp edge scraped meat from a stranded fish. But over time, the connection became clear. Objects could serve purposes beyond their natural form. Soon, the use of tools was no longer random, but intentional. A stone, chosen for its weight, could smash open shells faster than bare hands. A flake with a keen edge was carried and reused, not discarded. Driftwood branches, stripped by salt water, became digging sticks for clams or levers to roll heavy stones. The shoreline provided not just nourishment, but the raw material for ingenuity. Bones, too, found new purposes. The long ribs of stranded animals could be used as crude scrapers. Fish spines, sharp and brittle, could pierce or puncture. Even shells themselves were pressed into service, their curved edges used for scooping, their ridged surfaces for scraping. In the endless cycle of tides, the ocean delivered a toolkit, and the minds of our ancestors began to unlock its secrets. But what set these early tool users apart was not the objects themselves, it was memory. A pebble effective for cracking would be carried back to camp, a shell used for scooping saved for another day. This act of retention, of foresight, marked a profound leap. It was no longer about reacting to the environment, it was about shaping it. For the first time, survival relied not only on instinct but on invention. Children watched their elders strike stones together, mimicking the motion. Some blows shattered rock in useless fragments, but others chipped sharp flakes. With each attempt, skill grew. Around fire circles or in sheltered spots when fire was not yet mastered, tools became teaching devices. The act of showing, of passing down method alongside food, was as critical as the tools themselves. Innovation was no longer isolated, it became cultural. The tides also taught timing. Sharp shells and stones were abundant after storms, when waves scoured cliffs and littered beaches with debris. Groups learned to return after tempests, knowing the shore would be freshly stocked with both food and tools. In this rhythm, a new form of relationship with the environment took root, not simply taking from the land, but anticipating its cycles. It is striking to imagine those first bands of hominins on the beach, a mother kneeling at a tide pool, prying shells open with a pebble, a child experimenting with a shard of rock, a male carrying driftwood to camp to use as a digging staff. Each act was small, fragile, and primitive, but together they laid the foundation of something monumental. From these coastal beginnings, the path to technology unfolded. In time, tools would evolve into weapons, shelters, and art. But the seed was planted here, on the tide-washed shores of Africa, where survival pushed vulnerable apes to see not just what the world was, but what it could become. The ocean gave them gifts, but more importantly, it gave them the idea that the world could be changed with their own hands, and that was the first step toward humanity itself. For countless generations, our ancestors walked the edges of the sea, bound by the shoreline's bounty and dangers. But at some point, a profound question arose: what lay beyond the water? For Australopithecus afarensis, the ocean was both a barrier and an invitation. The waves promised danger, yet the distant glimmer of islands or sandbars hinted at opportunity. To cross waters, even in the simplest sense, was to imagine a world larger than the one at their feet. The first crossings were likely accidental. A fallen tree, swept into a river after heavy rains, may have carried a small group downstream. A storm surge could have stranded individuals on a sandbank far from shore. These unintended voyages, frightening and chaotic, taught critical lessons. Water could carry, and land could exist beyond the horizon. For fragile apes, these experiences were both terrifying and transformative. But soon, accidents became experiments. The shoreline offered driftwood logs bleached by sun and salt, buoyant enough to support weight. Observing how animals like crocodiles or floating carcasses moved with currents, early hominins may have begun to imitate. Clinging to branches or crude rafts, they tested shallow crossings across tidal inlets, rivers, or sandbar channels. Each attempt carried risk: predators, drowning, exhaustion. Yet with each success, their world expanded. Fossil and archaeological hints suggest that even before true humans, hominins may have reached islands. Ancient stone tools found on Crete and Flores point to sea crossings that predate modern seafaring by hundreds of thousands of years. If later species could do it, perhaps the roots of that daring lay here among ancestors who first dared to push off from shore. Why take such risks? Survival demanded it. Inland droughts could push groups to the coast, but competition there was fierce. New fishing grounds, fresh shellfish beds, or safer nesting sites on small islands offered vital resources. Crossing a river or inlet to escape predators or to reach untapped food was sometimes the only option. Necessity, not curiosity alone, drove them to test the waters. The act of crossing also demanded unity. One hominin alone, clinging to a branch, was unlikely to survive. But groups working together, pushing logs, balancing stones, carrying infants on their backs, turned desperation into strategy. The skills honed on the shoreline cooperation, timing, vigilance were the same ones that made these crossings possible. It is humbling to picture these scenes. A small troop gathered at a riverbank, watching the current with wary eyes. Some grip branches, others cling to driftwood. A call is made, hesitant, but resolute. One by one, they push off, paddling awkwardly, waves slapping their faces. Some falter, some return. But others make it across, and in that crossing, they carry not just themselves, but the future of exploration. Each success planted a seed of possibility. The world was no longer bounded by the familiar stretch of land. Beyond the waves lay new hunting grounds, new shelters, new horizons. What began as survival-driven crossings would, in time, grow into migrations across continents and oceans. The first humans to truly master the sea were still far in the future, but their courage was foreshadowed here, in the trembling hands of early hominins who clung to branches and dared to trust the current. Against every instinct of fear, they tested the waters, and in doing so, they proved that our species was not meant to stay still. We were meant to move, to push beyond limits, to cross into the unknown. The shoreline may have offered food, tools, and opportunities, but it was never a place of safety. If the savannah was filled with lions and leopards, the coast carried its own roster of killer predators, perfectly adapted to ambush where land met water. For early hominins, every step toward the sea was shadowed by the threat of death. Foremost among these dangers were crocodiles. Ancient relatives of the Nile crocodile prowled river mouths and estuaries, their massive bodies disguised beneath the surface. To drink or wade was to risk a sudden strike. Fossil records showed bite marks on bones that matched these fearsome reptiles, grim evidence of ambushes that ended in silence beneath the water. A single mistake, a moment's carelessness at the wrong tide pool could wipe away not just an individual, but a future lineage. Sharks, too, hunted the shallows. Though most species were small compared to the ocean's giants, they were deadly to any creature venturing into deeper channels. Even a brief attempt at crossing an inlet could draw their attention. For fragile apes clinging to driftwood, the circling of fins was not a symbol of mystery, but of terror. On land, the shoreline brought threats just as lethal. Saber-toothed cats, already skilled at ambushing on the plains, prowled close to beaches where prey came to drink. Their long fangs were weapons designed to pierce flesh and crush windpipes in seconds. Hyenas, larger and more powerful than today's, scavenged the same carcasses hominins sought, ready to chase them away or turn them into prey. Even the skies could not be trusted. Enormous birds of prey, with wingspans stretching beyond 2 meters, hunted along the coastlines. These raptors targeted the young and the vulnerable, swooping down with talons sharp enough to kill in an instant. Mothers foraging near the surf had to keep infants close, knowing a moment's distraction could mean disappearance into the sky. Smaller predators added to the constant danger. Venomous snakes lurked in dunes and rocks. Crabs with crushing pincers could injure unwary hands. Even the sharp shells and corals of the shore acted as silent threats, cutting feet and creating wounds that, without treatment, often became fatal infections. But perhaps the most dangerous predator of the coast was competition itself. Other scavengers, hyenas, jackals, and even rival bands of hominins fought for the same resources. At a whale carcass or a tide-swept fish cache, conflict was inevitable. Sometimes survival meant not only avoiding animals, but facing one's own kind in desperate struggles over food. In this predator-filled landscape, vigilance became as important as strength. One individual kept watch while others foraged. Calls of alarm rang across the rocks. The group that survived was the group that anticipated, that spotted danger first and retreated together. Awareness became the thin line between life and extinction. And yet, for all the dangers, they returned to the coast again and again. Why? Because the rewards were worth the risk. Shellfish, fish, carcasses, and tools from the tides offered a lifeline unmatched inland. The predators of the coast were merciless teachers, shaping instincts and sharpening intelligence. Through fear, they forced adaptation. Through risk, they demanded unity. Every encounter with a crocodile, every shadow of wings in the sky, etched lessons into memory. The shoreline was not just a battleground between prey and predator, it was a crucible where survival carved new skills into the minds of our ancestors. It was here, under constant threat, that fragile apes began to learn the hardest truth of all. Survival was not about escaping predators forever, but about learning to live and adapt in their shadow. The ocean was not just a backdrop for survival, it was a teacher, relentless and uncompromising. For Australopithecus afarensis and other early hominins living along the Pliocene shores 3.5 million years ago, the coast was both threat and promise. And in this crucible, some of the most important evolutionary lessons were forged lessons that would shape the path toward becoming human. The first lesson was awareness. On the savannah, predators could often be seen or heard from a distance, but on the shoreline, threats came from all sides. Crocodiles struck from beneath the surface, sharks from deeper channels, raptors from the sky, and saber-toothed cats from the shadows of dunes. This constant, multi-directional danger forced hominins to develop sharper senses. Every rustle in the grass, every ripple in the tide, every shadow overhead demanded interpretation. Those who ignored these signals rarely survived long enough to pass on their genes. Over generations, this pressure honed not just reflexes, but the capacity for pattern recognition, the ability to connect signs with outcomes, cause with effect. The second lesson was timing. The sea moved in cycles, tides rising and falling, storms arriving and fading. Shellfish could be gathered at low tide, driftwood after storms, fish in tidal pools before the waves returned. To exploit these resources, hominins had to observe, remember, and anticipate. This was the beginning of planning, of linking the present to the future. The ability to wait for the right moment, to return to a place when conditions were favorable, was more than instinct, it was foresight. And foresight is the seed of intelligence. The third lesson was cooperation. No individual could face the sea alone. While one foraged, another kept watch. Groups learned to signal danger, to retreat together, to divide spoils after a successful scavenging. Unity was not optional. It was survival. This demanded not only cooperation but trust. The bonds forged in these perilous moments strengthened social ties, and sociality became a survival strategy. The shoreline was a training ground for empathy, communication, and shared responsibility, the very foundations of human society. The fourth lesson was innovation. Rocks, shells, and driftwood were not merely debris, but opportunities. Tools discovered on the shore gave rise to the first sparks of human ingenuity. A stone that cracked shells today could be used again tomorrow. A branch that helped dig clams could be carried back to camp. Over time, the idea that objects could serve purposes and that those purposes could be remembered and repeated marked a profound shift. The shoreline was not just a place of food but of invention, pushing hominins to see the world not only as it was, but as it could be shaped. The fifth lesson was resilience. The sea was unforgiving. Storms destroyed camps, predators claimed lives, and accidents swept individuals away. Yet the groups that endured were those that returned after loss. They rebuilt, relearned, and adapted. This cycle of failure and persistence taught the most critical survival trait of all: endurance. Life by the sea demanded not perfection, but the ability to rise again after disaster. This resilience was etched into behavior, carried forward into every generation. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all was imagination. To face the ocean was to face the unknown. Islands shimmered on the horizon. Driftwood floated with the current. The tide revealed and concealed worlds twice a day. In watching, experimenting, and daring to step into the water, our ancestors began to think beyond the immediate. They glimpsed a reality larger than their own patch of land. Imagination born of danger, fueled by curiosity, was the spark that made humanity possible. Every encounter with the sea was a trial, and every trial left its mark. The predators forced awareness. The tides taught patience. The shoreline required unity. The tools demanded invention. The storms carved resilience. Together, these lessons accelerated the growth of minds that were once merely reactive, turning them into minds that could anticipate, innovate, and cooperate. When we look back today, it is humbling to realize that some of the very qualities we cherish as uniquely human, our intelligence, our social bonds, our creativity may have been sharpened not on the safety of fertile plains, but on the brutal edges of the sea. The ocean was a merciless teacher, but its lessons carried forward in blood and bone, shaping the destiny of a species that would one day build ships, cross oceans, and map the stars. The shoreline was not just a place of survival, it was a forge, and from its fires of fear and hunger emerged something extraordinary, the first glimmers of humanity. When we think of human history, we often imagine warriors on plains, farmers in fertile valleys, or explorers with sails stretched across vast oceans. But the roots of those stories lie far deeper, in an era long before ships or kingdoms on the raw coastlines of Africa 3.5 million years ago. It was here, on the margins of land and sea, that fragile apes first became pioneers. Their legacy is written not in monuments or cities, but in the survival strategies that laid the groundwork for humanity's future. The most enduring legacy of these coastal hominins was adaptability. Life at the shoreline demanded constant adjustment. Tides shifted, storms arrived, predators struck, and food supplies vanished without warning. To survive, groups had to remain flexible, changing their behaviors as swiftly as the sea itself. That capacity to adapt to see new patterns, test new strategies, and endure upheaval became a permanent part of our lineage. It was this same adaptability that later allowed humans to thrive in deserts, forests, tundras, and mountains. Their second gift to the future was foresight. The tides taught them cycles. Low tide meant shellfish, storms meant driftwood, and the phases of the moon may even have hinted at patterns in the sea. Learning these rhythms was more than survival. It was the beginning of long-term memory, of connecting past to future. This foresight echoed forward into farming, migration, and navigation, the very foundations of civilization. Every calendar and every clock owes something to those first coastal observers who linked survival to time. The third legacy was cooperation as culture. On the shoreline, survival alone was nearly impossible. One needed watchers against crocodiles, gatherers of shellfish, protectors of infants, and defenders against rival groups. This necessity forged a social glue stronger than instinct. Bonds were not just emotional, they were strategic, a living technology of survival. Over time, these bonds deepened into teaching, shared knowledge, and eventually traditions. The way those bands worked together foreshadowed clans, tribes, and communities. Without the cooperative crucible of the coast, the story of human society might have unfolded very differently. Equally important was the legacy of innovation. Every pebble carried, every shell sharpened, every branch used as a lever was a step toward technology. The shoreline encouraged experimentation. Failure meant hunger, success meant life. And with every successful tool came not just a meal, but a spark of understanding that the world could be shaped by thought and hand. This legacy reached forward into spears, fire, shelters, wheels, and ships. The technology that one day allowed humans to sail the oceans was seeded in the small hands of apes prying clams with stones. But perhaps the greatest legacy was imagination. Standing on the beach, our ancestors looked out across the endless horizon. The sea was a mystery, a danger, and a promise. To wonder what lay beyond was to take the first step toward curiosity. That spark, however faint, is what later propelled humans across rivers, deserts, mountains, and finally, oceans. Every voyage of discovery, from the first raft to the voyages of Magellan, traces its lineage to the first hominin who dared to wonder what lies on the other side. The influence of the coastal pioneers can be traced in the fossil and archaeological record. Ancient stone tools near shorelines, cut marks on shells, and even possible evidence of shelters suggest a deep and lasting relationship with the sea. Later hominins, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo sapiens, all inherited and refined these lessons. Some became island settlers, others coastal wanderers, and eventually humans became masters of the seas themselves. Yet the legacy is not only biological or technological, it is psychological. The fear of the ocean's depths, the awe of its vastness, the thrill of exploration, the emotions are echoes of the Pliocene. Our fascination with the sea, our myths of gods beneath the waves, our longing for horizons, all may be rooted in the ancient relationship forged when fragile apes first clung to driftwood and tested the waters. It is humbling to realize that survival at the sea's edge was not inevitable. Countless individuals perished, dragged by crocodiles, swept by currents, torn by predators, but those who endured passed something precious to their descendants: resilience, curiosity, and the courage to face the unknown. We are their heirs, not only in flesh and bone, but in spirit. The story of the coastal pioneers reminds us of a profound truth. Humanity was never meant to stand still. From the very beginning, we were shaped by forces that demanded movement, risk, and imagination. The shoreline was our first frontier, and its lessons still guide us today. Every time a child builds with stones, every time explorers set sail, every time we look at the horizon and wonder what lies beyond, we are living echoes of those first bands who learned to survive at sea. Their legacy is not lost in the tides. It flows within us, as constant and restless as the waves themselves, and it whispers the same call that drew them forward: survive, adapt, and seek the horizon. As the waves crashed endlessly against the African coast 3.5 million years ago, fragile apes stood at the edge of survival. They had no ships, no weapons, no maps, only their hands, their voices, and their will to endure. Yet from those trembling beginnings came something extraordinary. The shoreline forced them to adapt, to innovate, to trust one another, and to imagine what lay beyond the horizon. That is the true legacy of the coastal pioneers. They were not conquerors of the sea, but its apprentices. Every clam cracked open, every predator avoided, every branch carried across the sand was a lesson written into our DNA. And those lessons of resilience, cooperation, and curiosity would one day allow their descendants to sail oceans, chart continents, and step onto the moon. When you look at the ocean today, remember, you are gazing at the first classroom of humanity. Without those fragile bands who dared to survive at the water's edge, none of us would be here. Their courage still flows within us, as restless as the tides themselves. Now, it's your turn. If this journey into our distant past made you wonder, imagine, or feel connected to those who came before, show your support. Like this video to help more people discover our shared story. Comment below what fascinates you most about humanity's fight to survive at the edge of the sea. And, most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next chapter in this epic journey through time. Because our story has only just begun, and together we'll keep uncovering how fragile apes became human.